Hi everyone and welcome to the 20th Daily Critique, and today I'm going to be discussing 5 images of Scotland by Nick Seymour. I've actually had lots of photos from Scotland as part of these daily critiques, which is great for me because I love the Highlands of Scotland. And nothing specific to cover in this episode again, but actually in the final image I'm going to discuss how I might consider rearranging it were I there to form a stronger composition. So let's get started. So here are the 5 images that Nick sent in, and this one top left is from the Glencoe area, whilst I believe the other 4 are all taken in Assynt, which is in the far north of Scotland. So we'll have a look in Photoshop, and we'll start with this one of Buachaille Etive Mòr, very famous mountain, probably the most photographed mountain in Scotland. Ben Nevis isn't too far away, which may be better known, but certainly in terms of photography, this one is exceptionally well photographed. And this is the view from Buachaille, which is the peak opposite Buachaille Etive Mòr, so the other side of the main road. This looks like it's been taken on a rather moody summer afternoon or evening, actually, because is this looking west? I can't remember exactly. But anyway, very dramatic clouds overhead. And a very dramatic mountain. Buachaille Etive Mòr does look particularly spectacular from the other side, from this viewpoint. I think this is on Stob Buachaille specifically, rather than the summit of the mountain. Yeah, it's a striking way of shooting it. Shot above the river there, the road is not included, which I think is a good choice because I think it would only detract from that beautiful river rolling along the bottom there. The mountain is composed centrally, which is generally a very powerful way to compose subjects like mountains. It puts them front and center, and there's a good degree of symmetry to this mountain, which helps it work as a central subject. I mean, obviously it isn't truly symmetric, but it has enough of that quality to make that central positioning really work. And similarly with the hills either side, they balance each other nicely. So this central placement does work very well. It's been nicely edited, generally very moody feel to it. There's a couple of areas in here which I think are overly dark, so I did have a look at the raw file just to see what I might do differently, and you can see if I compare the two quickly, that actually these areas have been artificially darkened, and I would avoid doing that personally, because I think it's better to keep those structures open, because that buttressed face of Stob Buachaille, which is the summit here, is quite photogenic. And I'd also keep the white balance a little bit cooler, and just avoid pushing the clouds to black too much. I mean, as we'll see later, you can end up rendering clouds relatively black if you've got a lot of contrast in the image, and that can look very natural. But I think in this case, it's just a little bit of overkill, and I think there's plenty of drama without toning the sky down quite that much. So if we go on to this second image, a lovely line of trees here on one of the islands on Loch Assynt, I believe. I haven't actually photographed these islands myself, although I've driven past them a gazillion times. I've actually seen quite a few of these images, and they're lovely minimalist scenes, but I think given that they're relatively easy to shoot, I think there's an onus on the photographer to get everything perfect, and this shot is not perfect, unfortunately. For a start, there's a motion blur here. Some of this is natural. You can see the branches of the trees here are moving, but some of it looks like it's just straight motion blur. You can see this echoing of the tree here. So I think if you are shooting a static subject like this that is roadside and shooting it in such a simple way, you really have to get those technical things absolutely perfect. There's some scenes where the content is so compelling that you can get away with little flaws in how you focus the image and so on. And in fact, many of the prints that I've sold in the past or even currently, and the same with images in my book, have had a technical flaw or two. I do make mistakes just like everybody else, and sometimes you have to accept those. But I think a shot like this that's very reliant on the silhouette characteristic of these trees, you absolutely have to get the technical side right, and this one misses the mark, unfortunately. But otherwise, I think it's composed quite nicely, and there's a good balance of negative space to the clear focal points of the trees. So otherwise, a good job there. So I think this is Kirkig Falls. I've only actually photographed this waterfall once myself, although I've walked past it many times, because I essentially decided that there was nothing I could do with the waterfall that was particularly exciting, and really that's the complaint that I would level at this image. It's very well executed. The shutter speed is quite nice. I love the texture of the water here. There's a good sense of drama, in part thanks to the edit and that shutter speed, and it's a perfectly good illustrative photo of the waterfall, which I would find hard to critique, other than to say that it's just a bit boring, and unfortunately you are up against that to a degree if you start presenting your work online, because it's not seen as a collection of images generally, and you know, that can be one of the problems with photographing subjects like these, is that they just aren't that interesting unless you can find a way of telling a story that is more complex than here's a waterfall. So it might work as part of a series showing the general area and the variety of landscapes, and there are a lot of different landscapes up in Assynt, but on its own I just find it a little bit boring. So the penultimate image, this is a tighter scene of the photo we're going to discuss in a second, but looking at this from a critical standpoint, again, it's possibly just a little bit literal, and you know, there's a layering effect here, but it's all quite linear, just very straight lines. And the same in the clouds here. So there's a lack of dynamism to the lines, and with such a simple subject, I think it ends up just looking a little bit boring, quite frankly. And again, it's a well executed shot. The subject matter is potentially interesting. I mean, Sulven here is a fascinating mountain. It looks completely different from every angle you shoot it. And it's nice to have that dusting of snow. It starts to reveal some of the striations in the mountain here. And I believe that's Buachaille Mòr behind it off to the left there. You know, interesting subject matter, decent lighting, well processed, and technically good, but just not that interesting to me. Okay, and now onto a shot that really does interest me, that I think has been pretty well executed, but maybe there's some room for improvement there as well. So we'll start with the background, amazing lighting coming in here from the right, and a lovely transition of light going through these clouds. I love it when clouds just catch these subtle hints of a glow underneath them. I find that really beautiful. It's nice how they're broken up here. Does the longer shutter speed help or hinder the shot? Well, I don't think it helps it anyway. It just softens the clouds, so maybe that longer shutter speed wouldn't be something that I would do personally, but nevertheless there's nice structure and variety in the clouds up here. Really good rich sky, and this darkness that you see here appears to be a natural result of exposing for the highlights, and I believe Nick possibly used a grad looking at the original file, because there is this transition between brighter snow at the bottom and darker snow at the top, which I think is probably caused by the grad. But actually the gradding has been done very well, and I don't see that as a problem because the difference is relatively subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. Technically it's very well done, and this foreground here is just absolutely beautiful. I'm sure that I would have tried to include this foreground had I been here myself, because that ice texture is just absolutely beautiful. Wavy lines with sort of fractals of ice on this side, really beautiful. All together as a shot, there are all the elements that make for a spectacular image, and actually I think that it has been pretty well achieved. I'd be pretty pleased with this myself, but there are other things that I think might make this better, which I'll discuss now. And it's worth saying that none of this is necessarily possible, but they are ideas that I would think of. So firstly, let's break the image into two halves. We've got our foreground from, say, here to here. That's really interesting. We want to include that. And we've got our background that we want to include. And if I say, where is the interesting part of the background? Well, you certainly want this light coming in from the left-hand side. And incidentally, I don't think it's too much of a problem that it is there on the left edge. And you certainly want to include the mountain, and you want to give the mountain some space. So you probably want the edge of the frame to be there at the very closest to the mountain, but you don't need all this space on the right. But of course, if you put the edge of the frame here, then you lose most of the foreground. So the first thing I think when looking at this is, could I physically move the camera to the right, because that would have the effect of moving the ice to the left. So you might have all of your foreground structure running through here, and then you can put the edge of the frame a bit closer to the mountains, because then you lose all of this side of the image, which to me doesn't have much interest. It doesn't really hold my interest. And obviously in stepping to the right, this slope here would start to encroach on the mountain, so you would start moving that into the frame, but you wouldn't need to include, I don't think, this crag on the right, which does draw my eye. And so that's one potential way that I would look to reframe it. Another option is to try effectively enlarging the mountains. There are two ways you can do that. You can walk closer to them. Obviously, you'd lose your foreground. It would be a couple miles behind you. Or you can zoom in. So if we imagine zooming in, the problem with doing that, so let's say this is our frame now here. The problem with doing that is you would lose most of your foreground, so then you would need to step back and see if you could include the foreground that way. The problem with doing that, of course, would be that the foreground would start to become a lot flatter, so all of these lines would have less separation. So the advantage of shooting this wider is that you get a really good separation between these lines and a nice sense of perspective too. But nevertheless, I would be trying longer focal lengths, or the longest focal length I could get away with without losing the quality of the foreground. So those are just a few ideas that I'd consider myself, and it's a really, really useful skill to have when you are on location, to be able to effectively mentally rearrange your image and come up with shot ideas without physically having to explore an area. So building that 3D map in your head of how focal lengths and camera positions can change a composition is really, really useful. So thank you very much, Nick, for sending those images in. Particularly enjoyed discussing this photograph. And I think we've got many more photos of Scotland to come in future videos, so keep an eye out for those.